called Saving the Hurricane. The Hurricane floated on the open water, for there was not much more she could do without her mast, and with the little wind blowing, she barely moved an inch at a time. "This is hopeless, Phil," said George, one of the crewmen. "Aye, it certainly seems that way, but all we need is a strong gust of air." "How are you getting on with that nameplate?" Phil replied. George had been carving the new name, the Hurricane, into a plank of wood, hoping to cover up the old name of the ship, the Saviour. "Yes, going fine, almost ready to go." "Good. Well, for now, we will enjoy this weather and see where it takes us. We've enough food and water for another fortnight." And with that, Phil returned to the deck and looked out across the vast ocean, hoping for a speck of land. He didn't see any for another 10 days. The 10 days passed slowly, and the crew made the most of their time by consuming plenty of food, water, and rum, playing cards and dice in the sun. Phil began to get worried when he finally spotted land. It didn't look like much at first, and as they crept closer, it certainly wasn't anything special, but land was land, and they would undoubtedly find resources to repair their battered ship. It was another 2 days before they beached her. The crew leapt off the boat and threw themselves to the floor. "At last, dry land!" one of them shouted, and they all laughed at this. Phil stepped off the boat and looked around. The beach was sandy, and in the middle of the island was a thick patch of trees. He thought to himself that they could use one of these as a new mast, but decided they should look around first. Half of the crew went east around the island, and the other half went west. Mr. James, the ship's doctor and carpenter, went with Filthy Phil to the east, and it wasn't long before somebody had spotted something. "Here, come over here now!" one of the crew shouted. Phil ran over to find the crew in a big circle. He pushed through and saw a man, tattered and bloody, lying on the sand. He didn't look alive, but Phil noticed he was still breathing, very lightly. "Mr. James!" Phil yelled. The ship's doctor carpenter came running over and took a look. "Good heavens!" he muttered as he looked at the man on the beach. "Quick, get some water!" Mr. James patted the man's cheek, trying to get him to wake up, but they couldn't, so he pulled him up to a sitting position and poured a small amount of water down his throat. The injured man coughed and spluttered. "Get off me!" he gasped, and the doctor let go of him and he slumped down. The doctor noticed the blood on his chest and lifted his clothing to get a better look. The blood had dried and the clothing came loose easily, but the doctor could see the problem immediately. Or I should say, could see through the problem immediately, because all that there was under the bloody rags was a small hole in the man's chest that went the entire way through. You could see the sunlight on the other side shining through it. "I think we should get you cleaned up before infection spreads in," the doctor said to the man, but the man just groaned. He carried on for a few minutes before something clicked and he jumped up seemingly fit as a fiddle. "You're here to rescue me?" he gasped and grabbed the bottle of water, drinking it all before throwing the bottle onto the sand. It was Phil that spoke this time. "We can rescue you if need be. First, we need to know a little about you. Then we got some repairs to do on our ship. You see, we're missing a mast, and it'll be a little while before we're back on the water." The ragged man smiled. "A mast, you say? What if I told you that I knew exactly where you could find one?" "I'd say that you were lying to me, trying to get in my good books," Phil said. "Where on this island are you going to find a mast?" "I'll show you," he said, and led them behind some rocks. Lying there on the sand was a long mast in good condition apart from the splintered bits of wood at the bottom where it had snapped off the ship. Phil gasped. "Oh my, that's our mast. Tell me, what's your name?" The ragged man replied, "King Oliver." "Well, King Oliver, strange name by the way. Was there anybody else, or anything else, that washed up ashore with this mast?" And with that, King Oliver filled Phil and the crew in with the last day's events, including the story of how he reached the island in the first place. Phil shook his head in disbelief. "Seems that fate has brought us together." And King Oliver nodded at this. "We're certainly looking for the same ship out there." "Now, King Oliver, may the doctor tend to your wounds whilst we get our ship back in one piece?" King Oliver nodded and pointed to the woods. "There's coconuts in there, very fresh and very tasty if you and your men want some." Phil thanked him and they set to work. The mast didn't take long to put back, but the other parts of the ship that had been battered in the storm took a lot longer, including cleaning the barnacles off the side and replacing planks that had been eaten by worms. This is called careening, by the way, and by the time the work was done, the crew were eager to set sail. Phil looked at the ship one more time. The new name had been set in the wood. The Hurricane was ready to set sail. They floated her out to sea and hoisted the flags. It seemed that whilst the crew had been busy repairing the ship, King Oliver had been adding a little touch of his own. On one of the mainsails, he had painted a skull and crossbones, and Phil nodded his approval. "You sure you want to turn pirate?" he said to King Oliver. Oliver nodded. "I have no love left for England now, and I want my crew back, as well as your captain. I can only imagine how terribly he is suffering at the hands of that wretched Captain Steamboat." Phil nodded. "Well, wherever they are at least 3 weeks ahead of us. Any idea of where to go next?" "I wouldn't mind getting my old ship back, then at least we can stand more of a chance against the Royal Cannon." "You think it'll still be where you left it?" Phil asked. "I hope so. Only one way to find out." And with that, they sailed west towards the last place King Oliver had left his ship, although I suppose he was no longer King Oliver, and just regular Oliver. As for me, Oliver was right. I was being treated terribly aboard the Royal Cannon, but things were certainly going to get worse before they got better, as I was about to find out. Thanks for listening. Remember to like and subscribe, and join us next week for another tale with Redbeard. If you would like to support us, go to thesecretslide.co.uk and buy a copy of our book. Bye, kids!